You can go ahead and advance the slide. Thank you. We like to acknowledge the land that each of us are calling in from today. If you happen to know the name or the people that lived on your land at one time before white colonization, you can go ahead and add that to the chat. Or if not, you can look into native-land.ca, and they have a really cool interactive map where you can find out all about the native folks who lived on the land that you are on now before white colonization. We do at NOFA Mass aim to make our racial equity statement a living document that drives our work to heal the harm that racism has caused in the food system. And we urge you to act as allies to our BIPOC communities as well. We have a number of sponsors that help to support our work and provide support to the conference specifically. So we ask that when you have time, click through from the program book or from our registration website, and you can check out what these folks have to offer and hopefully support them the way that they have been supporting us. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our presenter. Matt is an orchardist, climbing arborist, and writer specializing in wild apples, orchard restoration, silvopasture, and cider. It's also known as Gnarly Pippins. You can learn more about his work and find the books he's written and other goodies by visiting his website, gnarlypippins.com, and we'll put that in the chat for you too. And you can also find him on social media. All right, over to you, Matt.
Awesome, thank you, Christy, and everyone who has helped to organize this. This is my first virtual Zoom NOFA workshop, so I'm hoping that this all comes through in the sort of clear but maybe a little freewheeling way that most of my talks when I do these types of things in person go. But I'm going to start screen sharing so that you guys can begin this immersive experience of restoring old orchards, which is the main, that's the thing that's going on here and what you all are hopefully very excited to learn about together. So I guess, yeah, usually when I do these talks, I like to engage with everyone and understand a little bit more about everyone's own experience or exposure or relationship with apple trees, especially like older, maybe neglected apple trees. But I think that maybe because we're in a different format, we'll just, if you have a question later and we want to ask that, just give a little info about where you are and what kind of apple tree relationship you're dealing with before you ask your question. There's a little context. And I'm going to get started. So here we go. So restoring old apple trees, that's the name of the game. And I'll just start off by stating what I think the thesis to this topic and the viewpoint on this topic that I wish to share with you all is, and that viewpoint is, just don't give up on your old trees. A lot of people, and the prevailing perspective that's given by, organizations like the cooperative extensions and those types of services that are really eschewing information from an industrial and a production perspective. That's really generally their viewpoint on old trees is that you got to cut them down right away and replace it with tall spindle or high density or dwarfing modern rootstocks. And my experience in dealing with a lot of trees over the past 8 years that might fall into that category is that older trees have a hardiness that is uncommon and are generally, with the right kind of care and oversight, and that's key. The right kind of care and oversight is key to making an old tree into something that will actually provide food for you and your community. But doing that work is, in the long run, much more rewarding than replacing the old orchards and old trees with the newer, the trendy type of thing. And especially in a place like Massachusetts, where older apple trees are a pretty significant fixture of the landscape, this is really valuable info. And I hope that, you'll get something good out of it. So I'm going to start by giving a little historical context here with the endicott pear tree. I always start things about restoring old trees with a little bit of information on the endicott pear tree. I know this is called restoring old apple trees, so I'm going to have to give myself a little break here, but we think of pear trees and apple trees in largely the same conversation about care, orchard care. They're obviously different trees, but they have a lot of the same needs and a lot of the same habits generally. And so I'm not sure if anyone's tuning in from like the North Shore near Danvers, but if you are a resident of Massachusetts, it is anywhere in the state, it's worth a trip to go see the endicott pear tree, which the big sort of claim to fame for the endicott pear tree is that it's the oldest cultivated fruit tree in North America that is still living. And it's been through literally multiple rounds of hell and high water. This tree was planted sometime between 1632 and 1634. So we're approaching 375 to 390-year-old mark for this tree. Now, this illustration that is currently on the screen, that is artist representation from the year 1845, which, if you do the math, the tree was a little over 200 years old at that time. So what you're looking at is the representation of an already ancient tree by the time that this was made. And what's a little bit, I guess you could say, contradictory about the endicott pear tree is that its stature later in life is much smaller because it has had to live through such incredible hardship. So that hardship kind of comes in different forms. You can see that what we're looking at now, this is 1925, so somewhere around 300 years old. But you see these kind of piddly little trunks. You're expecting to see something massive and grand. But this is sort of where one of our first concepts about restoring old orchards comes in, and that's the concept of renewal. A tree does not need its entire trunk in this huge hulking mass to sustain. It just needs little bits of young and vivacious wood. In the former, I'll go back and show you, but there's this huge trunk in the middle and these two little piddly things coming off the side. And you look at 1845 versus 1925, a little bit under 100 years difference there. The whole central trunk has disappeared. And the reason why is because in that century, the owner at the time had stripped all of the topsoil away from the tree, leaving it exposed, and only these two root suckers have survived, essentially. And so they're not even in the best shape, these two root suckers, but they are from the original root system of the endicott pear tree. And this is what it looked like in 1925. Now, in between 1925 and the next slide, I'm going to show you, which was this is a photo taken in 1969. Kind of a hard photo to see, but it's the only one that I have from this era. In between the last two photos, this tree went through a serious hurricane, a famous hurricane, the 1934 hurricane. And it had also been 5 years prior to this photo being taken, vandals broke into the private property on which this was located and used hacksaws, not even real like tree pruning tools, mind you, but just like crude cutting implements, hacksaws, to cut off every remaining bit of wood, except for 6 feet of trunk on each of these remaining two trunks, which were really actually root sucker expressions from about 200 years prior. And those haven't grown much in the past 5 years since the vandals made it when this photo is taken, except for just some twigs, basically. And that's 5 years of growth. Not to be mistaken with a pear tree is the like weird little pine sapling in the background. That's kind of confusing, but they put a chain link fence around it because this tree became a national monument a few years ago, but it was definitely not what the tree needed to survive. But if you look at the tree today, it's actually a fun visit, but it has really recovered, and it is this kind of beautiful modest tree that is really, really different from what you might expect, but with modern arboricultural, silvicultural, pomological, alphabetical magic, we can just really see how it has recovered and grown into a beautiful tree that produces quite a bit. And now the Endicott variety is recognized pretty widely. You can find, it's been conserved, so you can find saplings and you can buy stock of the Endicott pear tree, which is kind of cool. But that is all just to say, don't give up on your old trees. Even if someone breaks into your yard and cuts down your tree with hacksaws and it gets struck by lightning and your house catches on fire and burns the tree, whatever. Your trees are designed to survive, and with the right care, you can deal with it. This is a photo that a friend shared with me. I don't know if she's watching, but if she is, hey Laura. This is a photo of a Stacyville pear in Patton, Maine, that is just like unbelievably huge. And I've held on to this photo because it's always sort of like a wow kind of thing. But another example of a humongous old tree that is still going and still cared for and still produces, despite, the world around it kind of changing, and probably the people who've owned its property that it's situated on has changed many times. And in this sort of segment of the talk, I'm just going through a couple examples of old trees that I think are worth saving, because getting people fired up about old fruit trees is that's sometimes what it takes to get you to get out there and do the work to save them. Here's another example. This is a photo taken from the orchard that is located at Jim Jeffords, the former Vermont governor's estate in Shrewsbury, Vermont. This is a photo of an old Duchess tree, Duchess of Oldenburg, summer apple, pretty common in older homestead style orchards. There's an early variety. And the reason why I like to show this photo, and a lot of photos you'll see in this photo, you might start thinking about this again, but it's just the ability of an orchard's caretaker or a tree's caretaker to differentiate soundly between dead wood and living wood is absolutely fundamental to bringing old trees back. If wood is dead, it will never ever come back to life. Dead tissue is dead, live tissue is live, and it can become dead, but it shouldn't if you are careful and loving towards the tree. But another view of this tree shows you that there's just a little bit of living tissue left on this tree, but it still produces a reliable, small but reliable crop from the living portions of the tree. And again, you just have little bits here and there strewn throughout the tree where the blossoms are indicating live, healthy wood. And even so, every blossom generally will become a flower, will become a fruit. And so add this up and you get a decent crop of Duchess off of an old, kind of tired looking tree. That's a cool place to visit too. It's now a museum in Jeffords Estate. Another photo from Shrewsbury, which is kind of a cool place for apple trees, and a very healthy, lovely looking maiden's blush in this photo. Maiden's blush, of course, is the variety of this tree. And I like this photo because it's sort of another illustration for folks who might have an old apple tree on their property or in the neighborhood or on a neighbor's property. Even if your tree has a gaping hole in the bottom and you think that there's no way that this tree can stand up and no way this tree can hold a crop of apples to ripeness, you are definitely wrong. This tree, we don't really know how old it is, but it's a prominent fixture in the neighborhood because it produces very, very, very reliably. It's been pruned pretty regularly, as you can see. Not much dead wood apparent from this photo, and a huge abundant blossom from the tree. But still, right at its base, what you think might be one of the more important places for a tree to be structurally sound is this gaping hole. You see right through it, the pasture is shining through. But any apple tree, this goes for any apple tree, but apple trees don't need all of that sapwood, all of that stored lignin material from inside the trunk to stand up and be strong and survive. the most important thing structurally is the bark and what is just beneath the bark, which is the cambium. That's the transportation system for nutrients and sap and carbohydrates for the tree and all the plant hormones that it needs to initiate different processes through the year. And then, of course, it needs a little bit of wood underneath the cambium called the sap layer. And that's a common layperson name, but we're doing lay speak today. And the sap layer is important to add a little bit of rigidity and structural strength, but all that deep stored wood in the middle is not necessary. In the upper portions of the tree, this larger scaffolds, those will have stronger wood, full branches full of wood, not hollowed out. But still, this tree is not in tremendous stress. You could, if you were mindful, you could climb this tree and put your weight on it too. So don't let that scare you. Now here is a really sorry looking thing. This is an old winter banana tree located in Warwick, Wark as it is pronounced locally. And this is another view, helps to show you what is happening with this tree. But there is very little bark left, and most of what you've seen is just sort of like a dead-ish looking trunk. One thing that I think a lot of you will see, I'm going to go back and forth between the three views here. One thing I think a lot of you will see in dealing with these old trees is that there might be some leaves on the tree, but you might not know where the tree is getting that energy from. And oftentimes, if you try and maybe gently peel away dead, loose hanging bark, you will eventually hit a seam of living tissue, or callus. We call it callus, that seam of living, hard, firm tissue that sort of wraps around this dead looking trunk. And all you need is just a thin sliver of that to make its way up the tree, and it will give way to live tissue. And in this case, you can see that live bark is sort of spiraling in sort of a whorl pattern up the backside of what you're looking at now, sort of on this side, and there is small branching coming off of it. And all it needs is just a very little bit, and still this tree produces lovely winter banana apples. So don't let that scare you if you have that to deal with. Now, if your tree has fallen over, don't let that scare you either. That's another common thing that people get freaked out about, is if, oh, I have this huge old tree with taproot snapped off and all the roots are gone to hell. Most of the time when an apple tree like this will fall down, if it's very old, odds are it will produce adventitious roots from any of the branches that are in contact with the ground. And so that's a slightly more specialized process. I'm not going to touch super hard on that, but it's a question that you could always feel free to ask me later, or another person who's familiar with this work. But this is a cool tree. Happened to be very snowy when I was visiting it, but it's one of the largest trees I've seen, and it continues to produce. It's been growing happily in this position for several years, and all the roots that are sort of on what has become the top portion of the circumference of the trunk, which snapped out of the ground, allowing the tree to fall over. Those are all gone, but the roots basically that the tree folded over on, those are all still doing fine, and the tree has reacclimated to its new stature. And you can see that it has branches that are growing vertically from its sort of prone position now, and a very happy producer of lovely Baldwins. And there's my foot for scale on the trunk. It's a very big old tree. And so even if your tree has fallen over and is hollow, don't let that scare you from hanging on to your old trees as long as they will hang on. And I think this might be the last beautiful old tree before I show you not such a beautiful one. This is just a really big tree. You see my orange hat there on the screen is for scale, but an old Rhode Island greening tree. This one has not yet gone through my process of pruning and oversight and care and the understory for saving it, or I mean, not necessarily that it needs saving, because it appears to be bearing fruit just fine, but it's just an incredible specimen that I wanted you all to see. very lumpy and old, and about 5.5, 6 feet up is my hat there. And just tiny, tiny, tiny. Okay, so here, an important distinction between the last set of lovely photos and this one. Another old tree, a very lovely producer, as you can see, of golden delicious apples. This tree is in Hadley, Massachusetts. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because there are many ways to keep an apple tree sort of going. And this is a picture of this tree on a producing year. It is pretty biennial, which is not uncommon for old trees or apple trees in general. But one thing that's very important to notice is that it has all these struts that are placed under it. And one of the worst things, I think, is for a tree to be at a point in life where it just can't support itself. It's had too much of its structure removed in favor of heavy cropping and sort of the mindset of pruning an old apple tree that you just need to cut off all the suckers or cut off all the water sprouts, which is an old-timey kind of mindset of pruning an apple tree. And all of the younger wood has been cut off annually, year in, year out, since this tree was obviously much smaller. And the effect of that is that this old and tired growth, which is really only capable of fruit production on a biennial basis, a year on and then a year off, and a year on and a year off, so on and so forth. That older, tired growth, which doesn't actually grow in size much every year, is all that the tree is left with year in and year out. And the effect that has both on the bearing habit of the tree in terms of how regularity of fruit bearing, the effect that will have on the structure of the tree. There's just a lot of sun scalding and burning that's happening on the top sides of the trunks. It might be hard to see from the distance in this photo, but there's a lot of sun scalding on the tops of the branches there, and only the only living bark is on the bottoms of the branches. Most of the rest of it is hollowed out. And you have to put these struts under it when it does bear fruit, because if you weren't to, then most likely the tree would split apart like a banana peel, basically. And we don't want that. We want a tree that, even if it's fallen over or even if it has other structural maladies, will, be able to handle a crop of fruit. So this is not what I would recommend. I'll touch back on sort of cutting all the young growth first, not cutting all the young growth. I'm not skipping over that. We're just going to start with some of the how-to now, and do so in a movement from the most sort of visually blatant or obvious ways to bring older apple trees that might be neglected back, and then gradually move towards things that are a bit more visually subtle in what the strategy is, what kind of improvement we're going for. So here we go. This is a picture of a hislop crabapple, one of my favorite trees. I call it the pom-pom tree. And what you are looking at is this apple tree in early June. And all of the dead kind of brown, crispy looking growth in the tree, all of that is vines. So it's not the apple tree itself, but invasive species. The trunks of which, or the vines we've cut the year prior or the winter prior, so that in the springtime they wouldn't produce leaves, which could serve to obfuscate the pruner if you were trying to sort of take out the invasives and get those out of the way. So that's a recommendation for if you have really bad vine problems on an old tree. Cut the vines at the base early, let those sort of become lifeless, and then when the tree comes to life, you'll be able to see really easily what's tree and what's invasive. So in this photo, you've got me up in the tree trying to wrestle away some of these vines, and that's a lonely job. I recommend bringing some help with you, because it's a lot easier with a buddy. But this is the first thing you need to do. If you have competing species, an old tree is not going to be super happy trying to, use its already compromised energy to try and beat that invasive species, in addition to sort of making a recovery on its own. So removing competing species is huge. This is a picture of the tree after all the vines have been taken out, and it's a little bit pathetic looking, because so much of the tree had died underneath the vines that what you're left with is, kind of a hilarious looking tree. But the goal in this, opening it up from anything that's choking it out, like the bittersweet and Virginia creeper and grapevine that we were contending with in the last photo, this tree slowly will come back to life. And when I say come back to life, I mean that it will express new growth. That concept of renewal, like we were talking about with the Endicott pear tree, that's coming back, and it's very important because that younger growth, that is what you're encouraging this to take over this tree, to occupy the empty spaces in the tree, so the tree will fill out and generally become more fruitful through this process of renewal. So I apologize for the pixelation and the graininess of this photo, but this was taken 1 year after the last photo, so a whole calendar year has passed. And it's a little hard to see, but there are these sort of spires of green, vertical generally, that are popping up in some of these empty spaces. So particularly at the very top of the tree, where those two pendant sort of diverging branches turn away from one another, there's little spires of green popping up there where there's been a lot of sunlight exposure. There's also a big flush of green that is happening just one sort of tier of branching down and to the right from that top of that tree. A lot of new, lovely, lush growth happening there. And even further down towards the trunk, there's a lot of young growth happening around the sites of some pruning cuts that we made, removing dead wood. So I'll go back. You can see you're going to have to get used to a lot of before and after in this presentation, because that for me is very important in seeing what's changing. I hope it seems useful to you all. But this is year of renovation. So the first year after neglect, and then 1 year after neglect, you're sort of starting to see the first signs of life return to this tree. I should also at this point just say that this is not instant gratification. It's a long process. So then 2 autumns later, I think I took this photo, even though this tree and most crabapple trees have been, fabulous producers of annual producers of fruit. This was taken just last autumn, but the tree has really rebounded and become an excellent producer of fruit. We get this huge crop of, we call them Atkins crabs, a sort of a local name. We believe they may actually be hislop crab, but we get this crazy crop of them every year. And we're very grateful that this tree was not let go and cut down, but that we've sort of rehabbed it. So there's one example. That was sort of the competing species example. Next, I want to illustrate the necessity of removing dead wood. This is quite possibly the most important to remember, because one of those pieces of information that extension services are going to give you that is often heralded as sort of a rule of thumb is that, you can remove 1/3 of a tree a year. The answer to that question is no, you can actually remove a lot more of a tree than that a year, but you need to make sure that you're only removing at maximum 1/3 of the living tissue in a tree in a year. If the tree is holding on to dead wood, there's a tremendous burden on that tree, because it's holding material in the tree that can be infected with disease, fungal, bacterial, or mold. That is a pressure on the tree. Another pressure on the tree that is caused by deadwood staying around is shade. Obviously, deadwood doesn't produce leaves, but there's a lot of shade being cast into a tree, and that will sort of dumb down the tree's ability to produce flower buds. It'll just strengthen the vegetative habit of a tree if there's too much shade happening. So in this particular picture, you're looking at an orchard where there is some good young growth in the tree, but it's all located at the bottom, at least in this particular individual. The entire upper portion of the tree is dead, just dead, nothing living. So what we do with dead wood is cut it and you cut it gently because you don't want to cut into any living tissue when you're trying to remove dead wood. That is generally a rule of thumb for this sort of example and principle, is that dead wood, it can hold disease and it can hold icky stuff that can both contaminate your pruning tools and contaminate the environment. And you can cut off as much dead wood in the tree as you want, even if it makes up 75% of the tree's total mass or volume or area or whatever. But you ought to be making very, intentional and clean cuts and be more conservative at first, cleaning up your cuts with smaller cuts later, and doing so when you remove the dead wood. So this is the before picture. This is what it looked like before I got to it. And afterwards, we have only living wood, only live wood left. And so you can see where the cut was made, sort of almost at what would be human head height. There's this big sort of sloping diagonal cut that goes off to the right, or sloping to the right, I should say. And what's left is this sort of modest canopy. But if you look at the tree, it's like abstract art. You take a look at close and you say, okay, wow, that was a pretty big cut. But take a step back and it's a fair looking tree shape-wise. It doesn't necessarily adhere to strict frameworking guidelines, but if you look at the before, and then you have this kind of nightmare going on, and then you look at the after, you've got a really, really stark difference, but we're more pleased with the outcome afterwards, because now this tree can get some air, can get some sunlight, all that diseased wood's being taken away out of the area. So that's an example that I think really demonstrates dead wood removal very clearly. And so in the fall, the same tree, I took it from a different angle because I couldn't remember what angle I took the first before and after in January of that same year. But this is the same tree, and you can see it's quite a thick trunk, but all of the branches that are bearing fruit are very small in comparison. And that's important to know. Your biggest, largest diameter branches aren't always going to be, in fact, are literally never going to be your most fruitful, because as wood ages, it ages out of reliable production, becomes less vigorous, less vivacious, becomes a little more stubborn and old, and doesn't grow much. It becomes a little bit lazy, you might say. It's a great sort of metaphor for all living things. But this younger wood, by pruning and keeping that concept of renewal in mind, and aiming to keep the tree's core youthful, you're allowing that tree a much longer productive life, productive in terms of fruit, because apple trees legitimately only produce flower buds and therefore fruit on wood that is aged 2 to 4 years old. In some cases, with certain crab apples, 1-year-old wood will bear. But a twig which is 5 years old will not have flower buds directly on it. It's at that point aged out. So keeping 2 to 4 year old wood as the dominant force in the canopy, that is why renewal is so important. So on to the next. We're getting slightly more subtle. I said we're going to start with the blatant examples and get a little more subtle, because you all are becoming experts very quickly, and you're going to be able to take on even the most secret kind of mysterious apple tree restoration projects. So this is a old tree located in Heath, Massachusetts, very old orchard, and has generally been neglected. It hasn't been pruned. Prior to this photo being taken, hadn't been pruned in 30 or so years. And this is an interesting situation, because if you were to look at this before photo, it doesn't look so different from the after photo of the last one we looked at. So I mean to say that there's a lot of visibly young looking growth in the tree, maybe a little bit of dead wood, but it's not so bad. It doesn't look terrible. one thing I do see, we see a couple stubs of older, larger branches, which either rotted or broke off or something. And the landowner told me he calls this the bear tree because bears will often climb up the tree and, you know, shake it around, and they're probably responsible for those broken stubs. But in general, it doesn't look too bad. But instead of doing nothing, we're going to look at what we know. We know there's some things growing on the ground to the left of the tree. That turns out to be buckthorn, an invasive bushy tree species. So we're going to cut that out, that's for sure. And, you know, there looks to be on the lower left side of the tree. And this is hard because we're kind of far away, and this is a photograph and we're not in person right now, but there's some dead wood in the tree. It looks sort of maybe diseased, a little darker in color. Looks like the tips of the branches might be a little more desiccated. That's another hallmark of dead wood, is like dry, kind of crinkly, darker color, not that lighter, kind of almost pinkish in some cases, younger wood from elsewhere in the tree. So anyway, we're gonna work on this tree and clean it up. So here's the after photo. Not such a big difference, but still we have some improvement going on. So we took out the competing species that were on the ground to the left. We took out all the dead wood. We opened up a little bit. We did a little bit of removal of wood that looked maybe like it was alive, but might have been diseased. And so that's sometimes one of my mentors taught me that you can think of the wood you're going to cut out of an apple tree as 3 Ds: dead, diseased, and drooping. So we've already covered dead, we've already covered diseased, and then drooping. What's that all about? So the angle of a branch turns out actually counts for something. Go to the before picture. Primarily in the left side of the tree, we have a lot of branches that are almost pendant, like hanging downward. And those are the branches you're most likely to be receiving like an undue amount of shade, probably an undue amount of disease pressure as a product of the decreased sunlight and airflow that comes to a bushy pendant branch. And additionally, that's the kind of growth that doesn't tend to be very vigorous. Pendant growth is generally more full of spurs, fruit spurs. Those fruit spurs are the opposite of like water sprouts, vertical 1-year-old growth that produces only leaves, doesn't produce fruit. So that's the kind of growth that, even though you really do get a lot of fruit production out of sideways branches, lateral branches, things that are traveling in a horizontal direction from the main trunk rather than a vertical direction, we need to do a little bit of removing of that pendant wood, that those sort of drooping branches. So the 3 Ds: dead, diseased, and drooping. So in the after photo, you can see that we really cleaned up what's there. You can take everything out because we don't want to be cutting away more than 1/3 of the living material in the tree. We're being conservative even at that because this tree hasn't been pruned in a long time. But if you look at what we're left with, this is in October when Baldwins ripen. This is a Baldwin tree. You know, the fruit is very evenly spread throughout the canopy, and we don't have any clogs. You know, you're seeing in that lower left part of the photo where there was all that kind of cloggy dead branching, you're seeing some of the fewest leaves left on the tree. And that's because those areas where there's too much pendant wood, too much pendant downed wood, that can become just like a real clog for airflow, and disease pressure can build up in those areas. Whereas if you look at the more airy, upright, diagonal leaning branching, that's generally full of lovely looking fruit, very, very nice leaves still on the tree late in the season, which we like to see. So I think there's a couple more examples, maybe one more example of the tree before and after in the winter, and then the tree in the autumn. And that's an important lesson I want to impart on you too, is that you got to observe very closely. Even if the tree's not in your neighborhood, try and get someone to take a photo for you in the fruitful season, because knowing how your pruning affects a tree is absolutely key to understanding whether what you're doing is hurting an old tree or whether what you're doing is helping it. Sometimes if you have a really sickly tree that is really struggling and the pruning doesn't seem to help, it's oftentimes not your fault. It's just, beyond the pale. But in this case, and in other cases, it's very good to just try and observe as closely as possible. Okay, so next we are getting even more subtle, if you thought that could be possible. So another really big tree, we're sort of back in the big format now. And again, there's some dead wood visible in the tree. And I know this photo is a little funny because there's like a full forest behind it. And in winter, it can kind of blend together, but I hope it's clear enough that you can see what I'm talking about. I'm not going to dwell on this one for too long. And this is just more a visual exercise for everybody, but we're going to look at the before here and sort of analyze what we've got. We've got a lot of wood that is pendant, that's really, really drooping. That's okay. This tree seems to be in a decent framework. There's no crazy balance issues. Like we don't have all of the dead wood on one side and all of the live wood on the other. Got a nicely balanced, nicely shaped canopy on its own, just with the way the tree produced itself. Some dead wood will remove, but in general, it's kind of okay. But what our main objective is going to be to open up a little bit, get a little more sunlight penetrating into the inner canopy, and keep mind of any competing species which we have. I don't think I did too much in this situation because the tree's not dealing with a whole lot. Any dead and diseased wood, as well as what I just mentioned, that sort of inner clogging of drooping wood. So here's the after. Again, before and after. So much more light and airy kind of canopy. A lot of lift. We've given the tree a lot of lifts. So a lot of the lower branches often and likely getting shaded out. We're going to take that away and allow some new things to move in. Now, this is a sneaky one here, but I had mentioned before, maybe briefly, that you really don't want to cut off young wood in the tree. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right where I'm tracing, right there, that is a precocious sprout, all right. It has a lot of long sort of branch tips, long, well-formed young growth, 1-year-old growth off of this. And what's important to keep in mind with old trees is that they're doing their own thing from a framework perspective. If you've got a tree that grows from the ground with a single trunk and at 5 feet up divides into 4 different trunks, and they all look relatively equally sized or whatever, you're not going to do yourself very well to think to that pruning book that you read one year and cut off all but one of the trunks because a central leader is the way apple trees should be pruned. Forget it, because this tree is doing its own thing. It's fine without you, and it's fine without the pruning books. It just needs a little help in the right direction. So don't try and force an old tree into a paradigm of tree framework that it's not already adhering to. You'll do more damage that way. But by doing sneaky little things like I've outlined here with my cursor, allowing that one little sprout to grow and be a youthful force in the tree, even if it was a little bit lower, even if it was slightly decentralized from that sort of linear line from the ground to the sky that we often think of in central leader. I'm assuming that most of us who here might have heard of the concept of a central leader, but generally, for really briefly, for those who haven't, a central leader frameworked tree, that's what most apple growers and pear growers recommend. Rather than the alternatives of like an open vase or a V-shaped system. But a central leader is like where all of the fruiting wood in a tree are situated as laterals that originate from a single central member. And so keeping a strong central member that you never really, do any, you never mess with the central leader other than occasionally height limiting in certain commercial operations. Is the key to a healthy, productive, long-lived tree. So in this situation, what I've done is just let that little sprout, that young precocious sprout, sort of engage with the core of the tree, that linear area. If you have a really vigorous tree that is just overgrown with that younger, vigorous upright wood, you can leave a couple in smart locations as a guide for that tree's renewal. I'll touch more on that in the next couple slides if that didn't seem like a well-formed thought, which I know it wasn't. But we're still working in subtlety here. This is a Hudson's golden gem tree, probably the oldest Hudson's golden gem tree I've ever seen. I didn't know it was that old of a variety, but apparently it is. And you've got some very droopy branching that's coming off where my cursor is here. Again, sorry for the dormant trees with trees behind it in winter. Doesn't help too much, but this is another good one because we're not dealing with an express case of dead wood and competing species. It's another subtlety where we're trying to open up, enliven the canopy by opening up space for sunlight and let some new growth come in. So this is the before picture and there's after. I'm going to go back and forth a couple times. Before and after. So the key areas of this tree that got a lot of attention were really in the left, center, and bottom right. The top right is still kind of bushy, but if you go back to the before and look at that top right, that area again, you're still taking off a good amount, but we've left as much of that fruit wood as we can up there because it is very young. It's at the right kind of angles that we look for peak fruit production. And it doesn't seem to be stressing the tree out at all. There's no excessive shading that's happening from that. So the next photo, just the same season, different angle, because this is the angle that I returned to in the fall. So here's the, before, and then, so as I said, this is a Hudson's golden gem. That's an earlier season apple, and I did not know what it was until this day when I arrived, apparently too late to catch any fruit on it. But apparently the homeowner who's in the lower left here, she informed me that it cropped very, very well. Not insanely heavy crops, but that it produced a good amount of fruit off of the wood that we saved. So I'll have to remember that for next time. Get my seasonality of varieties right. That's a good one. But again, here's that view. And then look at the leaf retention. Sort of late season leaf retention is often a good metric for how happy a tree is with respect to sunlight and airflow within a tree, because the amount of time that leaves can hang on to a tree is not a really super concrete translation, but usually a pretty good translation to how well the air and disease spores and bacteriums and bacteria, I should say, really, and all those little microscopic pathogens, how well those are going to be able to move through a tree and not get caught up in the canopy. So late season leaf retention, that's good stuff if you can do it. All right, so this is, I believe, probably the last apple tree example before I have one more pear tree example. And so here we have one more Baldwin, I believe, but in the same kind of conversation as the last example, there's very little that looks expressly wrong with this tree, other than maybe in the top right, from a distance at least, we can see that there's sort of these twiggy, dead looking parts of the tree. And we think that because they're darker, they have they don't divide and wane quite as gracefully into smaller branches as the other living looking tissue in the tree. So there's the after. And you can see on the ground in this after photo that we didn't take off as much as you might expect. And this is another, probably my you got to know in old tree renovation, how much is just enough, how much is too much, how little is too little, that kind of thing. This is a light touch. We're sort of giving this tree a lick and a promise here. So there's the after once again. And I wish that I had gotten a great photo of this one in fruit and then the year after. I'll have to work on that for next time. But this right here is just fine for the canopy to leave. You've got three trunks that divide from that central leader, which only is a central leader for the first 3 or 4 feet off the ground. But we're not going to, tell the tree that it's doing it wrong. No, this tree's doing just fine. And in fact, with this situation where the 3 leaders are relatively equal in size, you might try and guide, like what I'm tracing with my cursor here is like, this is a little undersized, this whole segment of the tree. So we might try and guide a small vertical system in this tree to almost be like a mini central leader, as though you might assign a new youngish shoot or branch to each of these 3 to have like, a little central leader for each one. And that's important because it can, just having a vertical system at a higher part in a tree can help guide nutrients and sap from the cambium layer, which is transporting stuff from the roots. So leaving little vertical systems in smart places that can help keep a tree's balance really well calibrated. So that's another example of a subtle light touch on a renovation, first year of renovation. And as I said, let's take a couple questions first. So I'm sorry I let these build up. I thought I was going to be super great about getting to those. Let's see. All right, question from Jose. Do you take the buckthorn roots out? No, if you can dig roots of something as pernicious as buckthorn out, then hats off and better, all the power to you. But you also need to be careful that if you are digging roots out, that you're not damaging apple tree roots, which it is almost definitely intermingling with. If you use mechanical equipment to do so, like a backhoe or like chains and stuff, and you're ripping stuff, you're very likely to damage the roots of the tree, the apple tree in question. So I wouldn't recommend it. And the best way to do it is just sort of try to beat it into submission and get those woody competing species like vines and smaller trees to such a point where they can almost just be mown. So if you cut them really close to the ground with a handsaw or a small chainsaw or big chainsaw or whatever, the regrowth from those, especially buckthorn and other common things like alder and cherry that'll grow at the base of an apple tree, and honeysuckle and bittersweet and all that, the regrowth from those at some point will be so tender and small that you could run it with a lawnmower or a scythe if that's your style. And I recommend that route rather than anything else, because you could do more damage than good by digging roots out, and it might not even prevent it from regrowing anyway. So the next question there from Holly: do you manage diseased prunings taken from the trees? Yes, good question. There's a number of ways to do it. I think the best way to do it, if you have access to or have a neighbor or are willing to rent a wood chipper and you want to chip your old dead wood, by doing so in an area that's a little bit further away from your orchard, doesn't have to be like miles away from your orchard, but like maybe 500 feet, 1,000 feet away from the orchard site itself, if you can chip the branches there, you will generate a very good resource for yourself once those wood chips get to sit around for like a year, because all that disease pathogen material that will, if you have a good composting wood chip pile, which you don't have to do anything to get them to compost. If you just leave a pile and it gets rained on everything, then it will actively decompose and compost. All that disease and pathogen material is generally going to break down in a year or two. And those wood chips can be then used in top dressing and creating like a nice mulch area around the base of the trunk of a tree, which can really help for the trees. Sort of slow release of nutrition into the soil around it. So that's my favorite way to do it. A lot of people, and in fact, a couple photos back from here, you can see in the back here, there's like a little burn pile going. that's just as good if you can stomach, burning the carbon. Then, or if you're into biochar or whatever, you can get groovy with biochar out of your apple prunings. That's a great way to get rid of the disease pressure because nothing can withstand the fire. It takes a long time. You have to make sure you got the burn permit. That comes with some strings attached, but if you have small space, that might be a better area, or a better method. But those are usually the best ways to do it. You can also haul it off if you're just going to haul it off to like a brush dump somewhere. That's fine. But it is a good question because that disease pressure from pruned off diseased wood shouldn't stay in the orchard because that can reinfect trees and sort of weasel its way back in. So good question, Holly. And okay, I think we're all caught up with that now. So the other questions we'll get to at the end. Okay, we're doing okay. We've got about a half hour left before we're out of here. So this is I think the last before and after that we've got. This is a pear tree. I actually just pruned this one yesterday, and I decided to put this in because I was just so happy to be up in this very tall pear tree with 3 beautiful trunks. So this tree is absolutely living its best life with 3 trunks, no questions about it. And this is a mix of everything we've got going on that we've talked about. We've got some dead wood for sure. We've got some drooping wood, which is due to like heavy cropping. Sometimes the weight of a fruit crop can really pull branches down. So we've got some dead, diseased, and drooping wood all going on here. We don't have any competing species because it's been mowed well enough that it's not in such dire straits as some of our other subjects. But it's just a tremendously tall tree that has a lot of clogging going on in the interior of the canopy. So we're also looking at just a general clean out and airing out of these areas that are sort of trouble areas. So this is before, and there's our after. I'll go before and after again to play up the dramatic effect. So there's before. You can see even that there's some like leaves in the tree. That's very common if you have if a branch breaks during the summer. Those leaves will wilt and cure on the tree. They won't fall like the rest of the tree's leaves will in autumn. Those will just stay there. So you've got some of those in there, a lot of dead wood that's just like snapped and hanging with all of its leaves in there. Then after, once it's all cleaned out, so we've got much less drooping wood. We've got a lot of nice, got a little bit of like downward hanging stuff, but we think most of it has enough space and enough light that it's not going to be bogged down by anything. Whoops, there we go, sorry. Again, nice, young, well-placed systems in the top of the tree to continue to guide the right amount of nutrients. So I'm outlining one here on the left trunk. That's sort of like, okay, we might try and bring this tree down in height in a few years. So leave something like that there to maybe replace something that's currently growing, very healthy, lovely looking, but a little tall for some people to get up there with the ladders and pick, if that is the method of harvest that you subscribe to. And so a nice tree in general. So I'm going to continue to illustrate that renewal concept and that central leader framework conversation that we had. This is a tree located at Park Hill Orchard in East Hampton, and they have a lot of old trees which have gone through extensive renewal processes. And this is a nice one because this photo shows that central leader replacement in sort of more like an older version of the 2 previous examples I showed. In this case, we have, this is probably 6-year-old water sprout, 5 or 6 years old, that we decided, okay, the old central leader, which is located just above the red head of that arrow, that was cut off, as you can see, but we identified a level of dieback in that tree that was not going to get better. As I said in the beginning, dead wood is going to stay dead. Dead wood will never come back to life. So you have to plan ahead a little bit if you want to have a really smooth, nice transition. So, okay, we'll select a well-situated water sprout lower down in the tree from where that disease is setting in, and plan ahead so that in 5 or 6 years, you slowly are dismantling the rest of the tree so that this young trunk, this young water sprout will eventually basically become the new tree other than what's growing below it or to the side of it. So most of the fruit wood that we have in this tree is younger. Unfortunately, I don't have an after photo at all for this photo, but I'll tell you what I would be doing anyhow. So with my white cursor here, tracing, that's a great young scaffold that we like the fruiting energy of that. There's some really nice young fruit wood coming off opposite that I just outlined. Here as well is another example, some nice lateral fruit wood. And up and to the left, we have this old wood that is just adjacent to the trunk that we identified as having some significant disease pressure. And that's going to follow suit. We're not really super optimistic about the long-term potential of this branch because it's suffering the same decay due to it basically originating from the same place. So we're going to cut that off, and maybe a year. We'll take it slowly, but still opening up for this nice, precocious new central leader to grow a new tree for us. So this is like an extreme example of renewal, but very similar to what has been done in the past for like really extreme apple tree and pear tree renewal projects like the Endicott pear, except this is like a lot younger. It's like a 60-year-old tree. But same concepts, different applications. And finally, this is a tree that I like to basically wrap up with before we take a couple questions. This is an old Gravenstein tree, very old actually. There's a pole saw leaning up against the tree. That's 8 feet tall pole saw. It's like the length of a standard 2x4, leaning up against the tree. So it's about 24 feet at its current stature tall. And this is my favorite thing to wrap up with because this tree has been cared for really well. You know, you've got a tree's framework that isn't, you know, textbook ideal. You have like kind of an outsized scaffold coming off to the left, which is giving the tree a little bit of imbalance. You don't have anything mirroring it on the lower right. However, you know, the tree is absolutely able to deal with a little bit of imbalance, and it creates kind of a beautiful visual effect of a sort of dramatic limb extending out to the left with a lot of fruit coming off it. And most of the wood that's left on the tree, other than the scaffolds from which these fruiting branches originate, is very young. Is really, we're not letting any wood age out of productivity on this tree other than the scaffolds themselves. And this is where you want to be at with your renovation, your restoration of old trees. You want to be at a point where you can do all of your work with a pair of hand snips and maybe some loppers, because those are the only tools you need to take, you know, wood that's 1 to 3 or 4, 5 at the most years old off. So here's the before picture after we give it its annual haircut, and then after. So again, before and after. Now this is the kind of tree that your pruning books that are generally talking about sort of mainstream pruning theory, central leader, water sprouts versus fruit branches, leaf buds versus flower buds. You know, that stuff is going to be much more widely applicable to a tree that is in a state of care than some of these other like nightmarish things that we've looked at together in the last, in some of the earlier slides. But what you're left with after we go from something like this is that there's a lot of tiny twigs that are left on the ground. And we choose the twigs that we did to cut off because those are, you know, a lot of the vegetative wood that's not going to produce fruit for us, that's casting shade from the top portions of the tree onto the more lateral portions of the tree. You do have quite a bit of downward hanging wood, especially from the top, but we're making sure that everything above it is not casting that shade. Some of these older trees just have a pendant and sort of weeping almost habit, and that can be characteristic of both a lot of things, especially variety. This is a Gravenstein, not especially known for that, but in this regime of pruning, it's often it's common that you'll get that sort of downward hanging fruit branch if all of that shading material that comes on the top, like we see in the before photo, if that's removed, and you're left with these nice fruitful laterals, then that's it's kind of okay to permit that growth. You're not going to get the clogging and disease buildup from that, even in a no spray kind of situation. So that's what we've got to say about restoring old orchards. And I see that in the last few minutes, there's been quite a few questions trickling in. I'm sure a lot of people are getting ready to eat dinner and all that good stuff. So I'm going to start with the questions people popped in the chat. And if there's time left after that, we can take some. You can turn your audio on or whatever and shout them at me. So I'll start with Priscilla Williams' question. Mulching the old apple trees out to drip line with the aged wood chips. Should this be done? Most clients prefer grass. That's true, but your client is wrong. Forget what they told you in the retail business. The customer is definitely not always right. Lawns are outdated. Don't listen to anyone who tells you otherwise. You don't have to make your mulch lines extend to the absolute drip line. That's not always necessary. I think it's best if you can do that, but it's not always realistic because that ends up being a tremendous amount of wood chips in the situation of some of these really big trees. I would say if you can get 50% of the drip line in a circumference or a radius from the trunk, that is a really good place at least to start. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's on a case by case basis what the tree really needs, but I would say at least 50% of the way, nice and flat. Important to remember, you don't need to build the wood chip layer up that thick, getting toward the trunk. It just needs to be a consistent coating on the ground. No mulch volcanoes, none of that garbage. Hope that helps. Another question from Jose about polycultures. Are you creating polycultures or guild planting in these orchards, silvopasture, just grass and mulch? So it depends. It sounds like Priscilla has some experience with doing this for clients. I do too. Everyone has different preferences and different land use strategies. Personally, I have a herd of sheep. Me and my partner graze them rotationally in the summer, and that does include through some really old apple orchard plantings. That's not something that everyone's going to do. I think that using the language like guild planting and whatever, like a lot of the permaculture language, like without wanting to play into the like the cultural piece of permaculture, I think that like plant alliances and those ideologies are generally very helpful. I think that they're often played up more than is necessary, but I mean, comfrey and yarrow, like, go for it. Dandelions, super good. Anything with a deep root, anything that can aerate roots in the soil, even like vegetable crops, like, a lot of herbalists get like super antsy about getting the like magic wild native plants, but even if you just plant like cultivated carrots and stuff around a tree that's struggling to put on new growth, like that can aerate the roots and help them access the nitrogen that's already in the soil better. That's just an example. I'm not saying go ahead and plant carrots under your apple trees, but as an example, things with deep roots and things that tend to like make trace minerals more available, like comfrey and yarrow and dandelions, like those are really good to encourage and plant if you are so inclined. grass and mulch works really well too, especially if you have a purpose for using grass clippings or cuttings. So next question, I hope that helps. We can talk more about, we can talk all day about companion plantings. Ken Conway, good method of tagging trees. When's a good time to prune? Okay, great question. Right now is sort of the beginning of pruning season. Dormancy is a process and not a light switch, but I generally say that January 1st to April 15th in Massachusetts is like a pretty, a good and forgiving window for getting out there and getting the trees taken care of. I definitely do prune differently at different times of the year. I didn't touch at all on summer pruning in this talk. I generally save summer pruning only for those trees that have excessive vigor issues, meaning trees that are just all vertical growth, no lateral growth, no fruit, just all vertical. And that summer pruning is really generally reserved for cases of devigoration. So that's more common in commercial orchards and in orchards that have an annual pruning habit anyway. Pruning harder or pruning at all will not produce larger apples. That's a common misconception. Larger apples and large, like fruit size is such a dynamic factor. It has to do with a whole heck of a lot, and even some of that is just like the unreliability of weather, but definitely it has a lot to do with fertility, disease and pest pressure mostly. And then of course thinning and crop load management is like the linchpin there. But pruning, I think that especially with old trees, you should be, unless you have this like innate need for large apples, like most of the time you just ought to change your standards about what's a good apple and what's a bad apple, because a smaller apple, unless you're trying to, I know Ken, full disclosure, me and Ken are like good buddies, and I know that it's kind of hard to sell a small apple to a grocery outlet if that's what you're relying on. But for personal use and for like cultural conservation of the tree, the emphasis for me is always just on creating a healthy tree. And even ugly ass, like gross ass apple that's tiny is going to be way better than no apple at all. And I'm not going to nitpick over fruit size. So there's a lot to dig in there, but pruning isn't the answer for fruit size. Sucker pruning, good question. If I were you, I would treat suckers coming from the root zone the same way I treat water sprouts. That's a good vocab lesson for everyone. Water sprouts are from on the tree. That's that vertical 1-year-old growth. Root suckers come from the roots. They come from the ground. If they come from the tree itself, it's a water sprout. Root suckers come from the ground, the roots. That's another sort of thing where most times people will say, oh, got to cut all those off. That's just wasting tree's energy. The tree produces root suckers out of stress. It's like a dog yawning. Like the tree's like, okay, like I'm trying my hardest right now. I need to do this. We need more photosynthesis and more trunks in case something goes down. So my best recommendation is to, especially if a tree is in like really bad shape, leave 1 or 2 and let them grow for 3 or 4 years at a time until you have like a funny little tree. 3 or 4 years might be overkill, maybe 1 to 3 years at most. Let them grow and then select another one and let that grow 1 to 3 years and cut out the older one. What that will do is allow an expression from the root zone to establish enough and keep that root alive such that if a lightning bolt comes and strikes your tree and it explodes into smithereens or it snaps and falls down and it doesn't come back to life, then you can, graft that tree to the variety that the tree growing there or whatever your desired variety is. You can basically preserve the life of that tree through just one expression of a root. The problem with doing that retroactively, if you cut off all the root suckers every single year and you don't leave any, sometimes people call this bottom work, where you graft a root sucker as an insurance policy, basically. But if you cut them all clean to the ground, shear them down every year, if the tree gets, if it dies from unforeseen circumstances, the tree will very likely resprout from the ground, but it's almost too chaotic when that happens for the tree to recover from. And a graft of that age is usually either short-lived or unsuccessful in general. Whereas if you have a 1 to 3 year old sprout that's established and is clearly the dominant one in this sort of sea of shoots that get sent up from the roots every year, especially in these more stressed out trees, then you've got a much better shot of it actually taking. Some people call that bottom work. There's a place in California, Vulture Hill Orchards, that is like, they're experts in this particular practice. So I recommend checking that out if you have more questions about that. So leave 1 or 2 root suckers, let them grow for 1 to 3 years, and cycle them out on that basis. And cleaning tools between pruning, yes, very important. You got to use hydrogen peroxide or rubbing alcohol, especially if you cut into something nasty looking like black or discolored. Just get like a little spray bottle from CVS of peroxide or rubbing alcohol. They actually sell them in spray bottles now. And just mist your equipment. It kills on contact, and then you can just get right back to pruning. I keep that with me wherever I go, especially between jobs, but in disease heavy situations, sometimes like between trees. Benford Lepley would love to hear a bit on how you scale/climb these trees for pruning, especially the bigger ones. I wish I had put this photo in, but yeah, I guess that's a common question I get, is like, how do you get up there? I have a background in arboriculture, and I've been trained with a harness and ropes, and that is that's a privilege of the, able-bodied and youthful to some extent. And so I don't have any illusions about how I'm privileged in that way. However, there are a lot of tools that can help ease that burden for old trees, with a good pole saw, an extending pole saw. It takes a little while, and you have to do it in smaller chunks, but you can cut through even the biggest wood with extending and telescoping equipment. They even sell chainsaws with that kind of extending technology. So that's really helpful if you're not actually going to climb and get up there. I think that's the best method to do it, because you can get closer, you can make cleaner cuts, and you can supervise yourself in better ways, and you get to relate with the tree, which on like a personal level is gratifying. But I understand that's not possible for everyone. I generally say that you should only use a ladder to prune a tree if you are just going up with the smaller, less aggressive equipment, like small handsaw, hand snips, or loppers, things of that nature. Because if you go up a ladder with a chainsaw, like, that's how you die. That's how people like hurt themselves seriously. I have a general distrust of ladders, and I don't like to mess with them in old tree renovation, unless we're at a state like that last slide I showed with the Gravenstein tree that we just prune every year with small tools, because personal safety is definitely paramount at all times. So yeah, scaling and climbing is the best if you can do it. Rope and harness if you feel like free climbing is not safe in the particular tree. I like to be untethered, because it's a nice feeling to just move through the tree with just the weight of yourself and a couple tools, but sometimes that's not possible either. So a harness and a rope, which they make a lot of expensive ones, but they also make a lot of cheap ones that are easy to get set up with. It doesn't have to break the bank. That can really change the game in terms of getting up in some of these huge hulking old beasts. So I hope that helps. We can talk more later, Benford. Laura, hey Matt, great presentation. Could you speak briefly about some climbing gear, rope and saddle choices specifically? So yes, I'll give you guys a couple things for that, for anyone interested getting into like more climbing gear. There are many different styles of saddles. Like, you have professional arborist saddles, which are generally more like decked out with a lot of gear loops and rings and kind of funny gizmos and gadgets that allow you to basically clip carabiners that have infinite and insane things attached to them onto your body. That is really not necessary for the vast majority of Apple restoration work, even in the biggest, oldest, sturdiest trees that need the most attention. Climbing harnesses, like ones that are made for rock climbers, are on the other side of the spectrum, the least sort of cumbersome and lightest duty. They're made to hold your body weight plus a little bit, and they have plenty of options for where to clip a rope to. Although sometimes I find that they're a little bit lacking, because when I go up an old apple tree with a harness, I want to have maybe two handsaws, like a small handsaw and a big handsaw, or a small handsaw and like a small chainsaw, like an little electric chainsaw or something, and then a set of Felco snips. So having like a couple little gear loops to clip stuff to is helpful. The best compromise between that would for this kind of application would be like we call a rec harness, like recreational climbing harness, which doesn't have all those like crazy bells and whistles and gizmos and gadgets and doesn't cost as much as those, but is made more specifically for tree climbing. Treestuff.com has a few great harnesses that are like of that sort of grade, which I would recommend checking out. The one that I use, which I'm like in love with and I feel like I can sleep in, is called the Tree Motion, which is like a hilarious name. But I love my Tree Motion harness, and any old 16 strand climbing rope will be good. And we can talk more about like the really specifics later, but I hope that helps to get like set up. From Christy Higginbottom, do you ever wait until June to do some pruning to minimize water sprouting? If so, what do you take off when the tree is dormant, and what waits till later? Fantastic question. That is sort of like perfectly stated with respect to the conversation between summer pruning for devigoration and like what kind of pruning you do in the winter. And my perspective on that is that, if you cut off a lot of tender young growth in the winter, you are going to get exactly that in return. You're going to receive a lot of that water sprouting back. And if that's the main thing that your trees are contending with, if that's what you're, you might make one or two medium to large cuts in a tree on a given pruning year, and then a ton of hand snips. What I would do is leave the hand snips in the garden shed during the winter. Only cut the ones that you'd like make 2 or 3 big pruning cuts with a handsaw, or loppers if they're sort of like cuts on the cusp, and come back in June or even July, like after the tree has gone through its June drops, and then do some summer pruning on just the tender stuff. Don't make any big cuts in the summertime, because the bigger of a wound you make on the vascular system of a tree in the warm season, the more vulnerable, as you might imagine, the tree will be to anything that's going to be floating through your area, like fire blight or apple scab or Marsanino leaf spot, or any of this like multitude of diseases we have to contend with here in the wild, woolly Northeast. That's my best recommendation. I don't ever have time to do any summer pruning. So on a personal level, as someone who has like a lot of other farm chores to do in the summer, I just don't, it's not been practical in the past for me to do that. So I do all my pruning in the winter and just put it out of mind in the summertime. But I wish that weren't my situation. So I hope that helps answer the question. And Ellen Fine, do you ever work with ornamentals? Yes. And I actually wanted to point this out. I talked about the hislop crab in the first slide, that pom-pom tree, I call it. That's not strictly an ornamental. It is a crab whose fruit is pretty useful if you ask me, but ornamentals with respect to apples and pears, I'm thinking crab, like tea crab apples, flowering crabs, calorie pears, Bradford pear, things of that nature. Those are really great specimens to start with, getting warmed up with old tree renovation, because those crab flower heavy species are not as prone to the sort of finicky fruiting versus not fruiting issues that like large form apples can fall victim to, like, okay, the tree's been restored, it's growing nicely, but doesn't have the fertility that it wants, so it's not fruiting very well, that kind of thing. If you get started with the ornamentals and you get started with that, it's like lower stakes because they generally have a really heavy flowering habit. So year after pruning for the first time, you'll get a better sense right away from what's working for the tree, what's not working for the tree, because it represents itself in the springtime as like a profuse bloom. So working with, if we have an old crabapple tree that's been abandoned, same concepts apply. A little less gratifying in the fall, but a little more gratifying in the spring, perhaps. So I hope that helps. We got Rainbow Party, Green Rainbow Party. How does one feed an old tree's soil? Good question. Well, a little bit of what Jose asked before about companion cropping does apply. The key here is that like old apple trees, old fruit trees have, it takes a long time for them to actually get anything that you can put on without really deeply incorporating it into the soil, which isn't really possible in most situations. So a good thing to do at the beginning is to get a soil test and see what the tree is working with. Once you understand what the tree has to work with, then you can say, okay, we're deficient here, we're not deficient there, because oftentimes I find that the tree just needs help accessing the nutrition that's available. And for example, this last slide that is being shown, you got this big apple tree in like a sea of like vines and bushes. All those vines and bushes have shallower and more aggressive roots. Those are going to get a majority of the available water and nutrition that's coming to the tree. The tree is feeding on the surface, but it has roots very deep below the surface that's responsible for pulling up most of the finer nutrients. So, if you were to try managing the grapevines and the rose canes and all these invasives a little more intensively, then the tree will probably have an easier time accessing that. I think the trees have mechanisms for mobilizing nutrients that they just need a little help getting there. You don't have to break your back like incorporating manganese and calcium and all that jazz into the soil. A good way to help tree mobilize nutrition, the macronutrients like NPK, is to top dress the drip line with wood chips or other mulch. You can use anything, but I think wood chips are the best because it matches, when that stuff decomposes, it matches the fungal and bacterial population that the trees most want. So by top dressing the soil, you're enabling the tree's roots to metabolize nitrogen more quickly by there not being like a herbaceous sod mat on the ground. So that can help give a tree a little bit of a boost. It's like a little milkshake, like a energy drink, like power shake for a tree is like little wood chips can help them just burst a little bit of vegetative energy. You'll see that more quickly pronounced in younger trees that are in their establishment phase than old trees. As I said, it takes them a really long time to kind of find anything that you put down. But best thing to do that's easiest and cheapest that I've come across is like, wood chips, comfrey, a couple comfrey plants or a couple yarrow plants, a couple dandelion plants underneath to help get those roots some oxygen. And then also comfrey specifically helps to make calcium more available to trees, which is one of the trace nutrients that makes apples more flavorful. So hope that helps. Oh, and also calcium is important in the prevention of bitter rot. I think not bitter rot. What the heck? Some disease that infects apples and makes them not store properly. They get these little black spots. I can't remember what the name of it is, but it's a calcium deficiency that harms your storage, which is important for me. So calcium, plant comfrey. If you can't be with a tree in the winter, would you refrain from pruning in summer or fall? Great presentation. Thank you. Thank you. From Daniel Stevens. So if you can't be with a tree in the winter, I would cut what small things you can, but Christine's question rings true here too, is that you don't want to be doing these big cuts on live tissue during the season. That said, you can cut dead wood out of a tree any time of the year, but just be careful that when you cut dead wood and then you go to cut live wood, that you've maybe thought about sanitizing your shears, because that is a super, super good way to infect yourself with fire blight from the tree that you're pruning. So more vigilance in the spring and summer, smaller cuts generally, other than dead wood. Go ahead and take dead wood off and drag it out. But if you can't be with the tree in the winter, you should still prune in the summer. I mean, depends on what time in the fall. If you can get there in like late December, like after like Thanksgiving time, then the tree's probably initiated dormancy enough that pruning some of the larger cuts wouldn't be as harmful as it would be in the summertime. But it depends where you are, and I would encourage you to reach out and we can talk about your specific situation. What's a drip line? Okay, drip line, great question. Vocabulary here. Drip line is basically the imaginary line that is drawn by a tree's foliage diameter. So that is to say that if it were to be raining really super hard, the tree would be catching the raindrops in sort of a footprint from the branches and the leaves and everything that would stop a raindrop from hitting the ground directly. So that silhouette that it traces is the drip line. And yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of ways to describe it, but it's just the full circle around a tree that represents the extent of its branches. So that's a good one to know. Cool. I think that's all the questions that got. Oh no, we also have a question about Espalier. Do we ever do Espalier? Would love a talk on Espalier, though I know many orchardists don't enjoy working with dwarf trees. I don't hate dwarf trees at all. I think dwarf trees are mad cool. In the right situation. Espaliers are tough because they require you to have like a fence that doesn't like fall apart, and most of the espaliers I've worked on are on split rail fence that's like in various states of decomposition. I just did some espaliers the other day that were let go for a couple of years, and it was really difficult to try and steer them back on to some kind of system of framework. And what I found is that if espaliers are let go, then even for any amount of time, they revert to just being a regular tree, and the fence is like just inconveniently placed. Because the tree is a three-dimensional object in most situations, and espalier, for those who aren't familiar, is like a tree that's trained along a fence or other kind of like a wall or a fence, where the tree is almost grown as though it were a vine species, like viticulturally, like grapes. So it's not my favorite thing to do, but I also think there's a sculptural element to it. It's very fun. But generally, if you're talking about espalier within the paradigm of old tree restoration, then it's going to be a headache no matter what. They'll produce well, but they won't look the way you want that like fine English espalier or French espalier to look. But whatever, looks are deceiving and don't really matter as much. Bitter pit. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Laura. Bitter pit is the calcium deficiency that I could not remember. Oh man, love it. Okay, well, we're over time here, so I want to thank everyone for listening. That was really super cool. And if any of you have questions still, I'll stay on. You can unmute yourself and shout it at me. We can get anything you still want. And if not, just, remember you can reach out through my website, gnarlypippins.com. You can find me on Instagram or Facebook at Gnarly Pippins. Yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks, Christy. It's always great having your expertise on board.
Yeah, thank you so much again. We'll see you guys soon.